Vanishing Blonde, and I'm going to be using the Vanity Fair article The Vanishing Blonde by Mark Bowden, written in 2010. So Mark Bowden wrote the last article I read from as well, and this article did come first, but this article also discusses Ken Brennan, the private investigator. So he investigated on this case too. Sounds like he might be a bit of a PI legend, so I'm not going to be reading the article verbatim because I actually don't think that works well for me when it's so long, because I end up getting all my words wrong towards the end. But it is being used for reference, so before I go further, this case will discuss violence and sexual assault and true crime, and if you will find that too upsetting, please click off now. It will be delivered in an ASMR format. If you don't like true crime or ASMR, click off the video now. And I mean no disrespect to the victims or their families when discussing this case. It is just to raise awareness, and the reason I deliver it in an ASMR format is because I like to listen to ASMR and true crime, just the way someone else might want to listen to a history series in an ASMR format. So without further ado, here is the case of the Vanishing Blonde. So in the winter of 2005, I think it'll have been early March, a 21-year-old woman with blonde curls was discovered naked in the marshes of the Everglades in Miami, in an area that's really deep mud that backs up onto a suburban area. So it's suburban and then very suddenly becomes the Everglades. She was found by a power company worker in the very early hours, about 6 a.m. And she was unconscious, luckily, and not dead, as he first suspected. And he called the police, who arrived very quickly. The woman was Ukrainian and had been living in the nearby airport hotel. I think it was 8 miles away from where she was found, the Regency Hotel. She was staying there because she worked on a cruise ship but had very badly cut her finger and was being put up by her employers until she healed. She later said that her attack had initially started or taken place on the 4th floor of her hotel at the airport, and she had ended up in the marshes. She had severe head trauma, like severe. The bones in her eye sockets was shattered. She had been beaten very badly, and she had been raped, and they actually found semen inside her, which is awful and very, very sad. So she said that her attack had been carried out by 2 or 3 white men who had Hispanic accents. Unfortunately, because of her broken English, it was difficult for them to understand her story properly. And one of the first things she said when she woke up from her coma, not a coma but being unconscious, was she asked for her lawyer, which was incredibly unusual for a victim of sexual assault to do when they first wake up. She had been having violent flashbacks of being like carried or thrown over things while she was transported, but they were flashbacks and they were horrible, so they weren't easy for her to give evidence with. The lawyer, she actually very quickly got her lawyer to sue the hotel for negligence and not looking after her properly, basically saying these men got into her room, and the police thought this was fishy because this is very unusual for a rape victim to do, especially so early on. Though no judgment, everyone handles things differently, but it was just unusual behaviour. Usually the victims too traumatised to act on anything in the early days, so they did think this was strange. They did extensive interviews and a thorough investigation of the hotel, and leads tended to dry up very quickly. The hotel hired a firm to represent them in this case, and this firm went on to hire private investigator Ken Brennan, who I mentioned earlier. So Ken Brennan is, as described previously in my other video, I will take no shit and I will just get this this solved. He's interested in the mystery. He's not interested in like making as much money as possible, so he won't just lie to get his client what they want. If the investigation shows the hotel were at fault, that's what he would say. So when he makes that very clear, and he very swears a lot as well, so you can kind of get a sort of a hint of his character there. So he reviewed the case. He found that the victim's memory was all over the place, which can be quite common, I imagine, but I think even more so than they would expect. And you know, her facts change quite a lot. She changed at one point from saying that the accent of her attackers was Hispanic to Romanian, which was strange, they thought. The hotel had extensive security, like high walls, you know, they could easily keep a track of who was coming in and out of the hotel at all times because of the security. And they saw that on the hours before she was discovered at 3:41 a.m. she was seen entering her hotel room, but then she cannot be seen leaving. So how did she get into the marshes? Which is, you know, is really, really strange. She was seen leaving the hotel previously. She was actually seen a lot on CCTV in the months that she'd been staying there. She obviously was bored and restless. She'd go down and speak to the reception team, etc. So they know her on the footage, so it's strange that they can't see her leaving the hotel or anyone else leaving with her. And before she left, she had walked to a nearby gas station at about 3 a.m. to call her mother in the Ukraine, and returned. And that's when she'd returned. And on returning to her hotel room, she got in the elevator and was seen entering with a large black man who was described as 6'4" and weighing 300 pounds. And they had a bit of a casual conversation. And then she enters the room at 3:41 a.m. And isn't seen again. So it's very strange. They can't work out how she got out. Ken's thinking, is it possible that she was lowered out of the hotel window? But there's no evidence of them doing this. There's no rope burns. There's nothing about her being dropped. There's no scratches from the bushes that are under the window. It was basically just impossible, and it's so unlike these people are kind of like such violent, frantic killers or rapists, that they don't organise things that well. So she had to have gone out through the lobby, and after reviewing the footage for hours and hours, he actually sees the man that she had been speaking to enter a room around the same time as her, and then enter the elevator and then come back into the lobby at 5:28 a.m. and then with a large suitcase, but then come back to the hotel a few hours later. So he left at 5:28 a.m. in the morning, 2 hours after he'd entered his room with a suitcase, but then he wasn't checking out and he wasn't leaving, and he came back to the hotel without this suitcase later. So Ken then decided that this woman must have been in the suitcase. That's how she got out of the hotel, that's how she left. However, the suitcase did seem too small. It's an overhead compartment one, and the man himself was so big that he thought maybe this was an illusion. Maybe the suitcase seemed small in comparison to him. He actually ended up like working out the size of the suitcase by comparing it to the size of the elevator door and measured. He obtained a suitcase that fit the measurements, and then he invited a flexible young woman, as his quote, "That would not be me, I'm not flexible," whose proportions matched the victim's, and she did fit when she tried to curl up inside it. He notices that as the man drags the bag over the elevator, it does get stuck for a second and he has to pull at it, and that makes Brennan think that this is actually a heavy suitcase, because it would have to be that heavy, and then it makes him convinced that that means the woman is inside. So even though she said they were white men, she must have been confused, like she was badly beaten, and he had decided that this guy was a serious suspect. Brendan actually found it chilling that the man's demeanour was so calm, because he's been a policeman himself, and he's seen that ordinary men get caught up in the aftermath of a violent crime and they're usually shaking and panicking, even if they're guilty as hell. And this guy is really calm, and that is what he finds chilling, and he actually thinks he's done this before. When Brennan pitched this to the people that as you can imagine. But he really wanted this solved, and he could see that this guy was getting away with it, and he didn't want it to happen again, and he managed to convince them to carry on. Apparently the hotel weren't diligent at photocopying people's driver's licenses, and if they were, this was 2005, it wasn't a very clear image, black and white, kind of like a muddy picture, so we had to rely on the video, to scrutinise the appearance of the suspect and get a kind of clear idea of who this guy was. In a video snippet he finds of the man previously, he's walking to the restaurant with a fit black man wearing a white t-shirt with the word Mercury on the front. They're seen a lot together. He decides that they must know each other, they're actually there together, and the other man, the second man, is actually seen wearing a tag that he can't make out, and he even contacts NASA, but they say because of the type of camera they don't have the equipment to enhance the picture and they can't find out, unfortunately. After reviewing the footage for much longer, he realises that the back of the t-shirt of the second man has the word Verado on it, which he googles, and it is the name of a new outboard engine manufactured by Mercury, like the front of the t-shirt, Mercury Marine, the boat engine manufacturer. So at the time of the attack there had been a big boat show in Miami in February, which kind of makes sense because, you know, it's Miami. And he's thinking perhaps the man in the white t-shirt had been working for the show and maybe his friend had too. He actually later works out that the man hadn't been working for him because the company confirmed that they had put their staff up and everyone who had worked on the booths had all stayed at different hotels. But he did ask, oh, where did you get these t-shirts then? And the only way to get them was at the boat show's food court. The food court was set up by a company called Centerplate, and it turns out they did put some of their employees up at the Regency, but they did hire for 200 people from all across the country. And he said, well, this guy's quite distinctive. He's, you know, huge. He's 6'4", 300 pounds, and in glasses. So surely someone would know who they meant. Apparently, people did remember this man, but no one knew his name, and someone recalled that he had initially been hired to work at Zephyr Field, home of the New Orleans Zephyrs, a minor league baseball team, but Hurricane Katrina had devastated the city and the residents had been evacuated, so again, this is difficult to trace the man based on this. So a few months in, Brennan was feeling annoyed that he wasn't getting anywhere but stubborn. He knew that the firm and the hotel really wanted to tell him that this woman, this victim, was actually a sex worker who had been beaten by one of her clients, but this just wasn't the case, he believed, and he would not lie. He was getting paid not enough for the hours he was putting in because he actually cared about solving this case. He just kept thinking about this man getting away with the crime and probably doing it again, and he just couldn't stand that idea. Brennan actually calls in a favour with a fellow cop that he used to work with, who does go over above and beyond to find out who this guy is, and he actually calls and said, I have good news and bad news, and the good news is I know who the guy is. And when Brennan asks what's the bad news, he says his name is Mike Jones. There's probably a million of them, and he doesn't work there anymore, and nobody knows where he went. So they know his name, but it's a very common name, and now they don't know where he is now, but that is still a name. When Brennan checked the Regency database, he did find a Mike Jones who had checked in on the 14th of February, 7 days before the rape and assault, and then had checked out 22nd, 1 day after he was seen rolling his suitcase to the car. So his full name on his visa was Michael Lee Jones. Unfortunately, the card had been cancelled. The address was for a Virginia residence that Jones had vacated earlier, and he had left no forwarding address. And Brennan wasn't a policeman anymore, so he didn't have the authority to, you know, get further information from the credit card company, etc. The phone number that Jones had left was for Centerplate, so he hadn't even left his own phone number, so, but it was, you know, still information leading to a warm trail again. So he knew that this man, Mike Jones, had done this before due to his demeanour. He'd obviously done this many serial rapist, which is grim, and he wasn't going to give up an arrangement like that. If he wanted to carry on, where would he go next? So Brennan got some names from Centerplate and went online and compiled a list of the food service company's 20 to 25 top competitors. So Brennan works his way down the list and he got struck out one by one, but one of the companies, Ovations, had its headquarters in Tampa, and Brennan was heading up that way anyway, so he knew that going in and speaking to them directly was always the best thing to do. He stopped by and he talked his way into the office of the company's COO and explained about his manhunt and asked if they had ever had an employee who was a 300+ pound black man with glasses named Michael Lee Jones. This time the executive didn't check the database and he told Brennan that he was not a law enforcement official, that if he wanted information he would have to return with a subpoena. All the other companies had just checked the database, so this is where he finally thought he had the right place, that they had something to hide. And he actually outright said to them, "Why would you want someone working for you who is a rapist?" And the executive had just replied saying, "Get a subpoena." So he obviously could get this subpoena anyway. He was working with the police, Detective Foote specifically, who had done the initial investigation, who gave him the subpoena, and it turned out they did have an employee named Michael Lee Jones who fit the description, and he was working in Frederick, Maryland. So Detective Foote and one of his partners travel to the Harry Grove Stadium where he was working, and it was at the foot of the Appalachian foothills mountains, and it was cool, and they just showed up to speak to him, even though Foote was skeptical because he thought it was a bit of a long shot, because you know there wasn't loads of evidence. Detective Foote called Jones earlier that day to check he would be available. He kept it vague. He said he was investigating an incident in Miami that had happened during the boat show, and confirmed that Jones had been working there. On the phone, Jones was polite, apparently. He said he'd been in Miami at the time, and that he would be available to meet Foote, give him directions, etc. to where to meet him. Foote said that Jones was massive, like tall, wide, powerful, just everything, like big hands and a big belly. He said his size was intimidating, but it was counteracted by the fact that he was soft-spoken, gentle, quite passive. He wore clear-rimmed glasses and spoke in a friendly way. He was in charge of the operation at the food counter. He appeared to be respected and well-liked by his employees, and he was even wearing an apron, so not what they expected. Foote later said that he had asked Jones about did he meet any women in Miami, and Jones said he had hooked up once. When the detective asked him to describe this woman, he said, quote, "I only have sex with white women," unquote. He said that he hadn't had sex with anyone at the Regency Hotel. He said they had been working at the boat show and they had hooked up elsewhere. None of these women were blonde, and they asked him if any had a foreign accent, and he said that the woman he had had sex with had been German, not Ukrainian. Apparently Foote just did not see this guy being felonies, including rape, kidnap, and beating a young woman severely. He was just completely forlorn. He said there's no way he never got angry. His soft, peculiar voice that was described just kept denying, protesting, again never growing angry. I just didn't do this. He's never had any problems with paying women for sex, he said. He did not get a kick out of hurting women. He did admit that the DNA test, connected him to the victim, and he said, yes, I had sex with her, but he insisted that she was, quote, a hooker, and that he had paid her $100, and that when he left her, she was in fine shape, although very drunk. They did show him pictures of her battered face, and he just said, I did not hurt that girl. Quote, I'm not violent, I never hit a fucking woman in my whole fucking life, and I'm not going to hurt her. So Brennan asked him why he would roll his suitcase out into the parking lot and stash it in his car at 5 in the morning, days before he needed to check out the hotel. And he said he just couldn't remember which day he was leaving, and for some reason I thought, fuck it, it's time to go, as he put it. So it just seemed like maybe he did just have consensual sex with this woman, but Brennan still wasn't convinced, and he was able to trip Jones up with one small thing. Jones says that his suitcase only had his clothes, shoes and a video game in it, but when the detective noticed on the extra tug that Jones had needed to get it off the elevator, Jones had suddenly remembered that it had a large number of books in it as well, large books, and he was an avid reader, and when he asked him to name some of the books, Jones could not think of a single title. So Jones continued to be, quote, unfailingly compliant, which worked for him, and even with the DNA, the case was weak because he had a good reason for not having volunteered initially that he had paid a woman for sex, as he had a prior arrest for soliciting a prostitute, or a sex worker as we would say now. Remember, this article is 10 years old, and it would count against him. So if he admitted to it, he would say, I was worried I was going to get in trouble, and it would account for the DNA. So that was a real shame. It would be his word against the young woman's, and she was not a good witness to use. She had picked Jones out of a photo lineup, but her memory had been so foggy that she seemed unreliable, and the fact that she had seen Jones before, unlike the other faces she was shown, was not convincing evidence of his guilt, and her initial accounts of the crime were so much at odds with Brennan's findings that even Foote did find himself wondering who was telling the truth, because she had said 3 white men, and it's just a shame. Obviously she'd just been beaten so badly. I mean, I can't imagine. She had severe trauma to her head, to the point where her occipital bone had been shattered, her eye socket bone, and your memory would be terrible. You'd be in shock. You would be, you might be trying to repress things, so no one could expect to remember these things, but it did mean that it was difficult to get Jones based on her testimony. Sorry if you heard that car beeping. So in the end, the Miami prosecutors ended up settling with Jones, so he was returned to Miami and pleaded guilty to sexual assault in return for having all of the more serious charges against him dropped, and he was sentenced to 2 years in prison, which we all know could easily go down to 6 months with good behaviour. This outcome would have been very devastating for Brennan had that been the end of the story, but it was not. So Brennan hadn't doubted for a second that Jones was a rapist, and he was convinced that sexual assault was a pastime for Jones. That's how it's worded in this article. Disturbing, basically. So that's why he's so calm, because it's just a daily part of his life, and he's not worried about it. He even gave up the DNA sample willingly, knowing that that would, just end up with him in jail for a short period of time, but would save him a lot of grief in the future. Brennan said put him in the DNA database, and I bet he's done something else, and he was right. So when they did this in late 2006, 3 new hits came up related to his DNA. In Colorado Springs, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman had been picked up early in the morning on the 1st of December 2005 by a stranger, a very large black man with glasses. He had offered her a ride and then told partying in the French Quarter, a little too hard by her own admission, that's what she says. And very early on the morning of May 5th, 2003, she had gone looking for a black cab to take her home, and a very large black man with glasses had pulled his car over to the curb and offered her a ride. Basically, he had pulled up in the cab, offered her a lift, she got in, I think she assumed he was a cab, then he had taken to her a weedy lot and assaulted her, raped her, and she had actually bit his palm so hard that she had bits of his skin in her teeth, which is gross but good for you, girl. So when he left her after, she reported it to the police, who filed her account and took a DNA sample. This case sat until CODIS matched it with the Michael Lee Jones specimen of the case we're talking about. The other New Orleans victim told a similar tale but failed to pick Jones's face up out of the lineup, so I don't know if that meant that he didn't get tried, which is such a shame. He deserves to be punished for all his crimes. And it turns out that Jones had been in both Colorado Springs and New Orleans on the day in question. In 2008, he was flown to Colorado Springs to stand trial. Unfortunately, this is so sad, but the Colorado woman had died in the interim due to unrelated things to the crime, which is awful. That she'd gone through that and now she's died quite young by the sounds of it. So they had no victims put on the stand, but they fashioned a new case using the other two rapes and calling them as witnesses calling as witnesses the Miami victim and one of the New Orleans victims. They supplemented DNA evidence by pointing Jones out as their attacker. So there was the DNA evidence, and they also said that he attacked them, which is what was lacking in the original case because she thought it was white men. So it was seen that the cases showed a common plan schema design, and it was a signature trail. So it turned out the first New Orleans victim was a very effective witness. She was clear and emphatic and still outraged at what had happened to her, and she referenced her own, what she called poor judgment, that she displayed that night. I just hate to say that because it sounds like victim blaming to me, but whatever, that's what she said. And the other victim wasn't as great, unfortunately. She struggled with English and her account was confusing, which is such a shame, but at least we had the first witness, I guess. So Jones pleaded not guilty to all the charges in the Colorado case. So he said that the women had been sex workers claiming rape. So jurors might have been able to say that, except the two sex workers maybe might say foul rape charges, but both cases immediately describing the attacker as a huge black man with glasses. It is very unlikely that the three would do this, and there was no evidence of the victims being sex workers, and there was the DNA, so it was a really good case. Now, so as a result of this case, Michael Lee Jones is now serving what amounts to a life sentence at the Fremont Correctional Facility in Colorado. He received a term of 24 years to life for one count of sexual assault with force and 12 years to life for the second count of felonious sexual contact. He is 38 and will not be eligible for his first parole hearing until 2032. So this was written 10 years ago. So at the time, so now he'll be 48 and he will be 12 years away from his first parole hearing, so he'll be 60 when he can. The state estimates that his term will last until he dies. So the Miami victim won a £300,000 settlement from the hotel and the hotel security company. So after all that, after hiring Ken, he didn't actually help them, and that just shows that he's in it to solve the case. So Ken Brennan is proud of his efforts to get Jones locked away. See, these cases get on him and they're just the tip of the iceberg. And he just thinks that, it's just the tip of the iceberg check the DNA files because you're guaranteed to have found more because these people are serial offenders. And it ends by saying so far his hunches have been pretty good. So I hope you enjoyed that different format of me just discussing it, like reading my notes. Let me know which you prefer. I actually think I prefer doing it that way than reading it, but let me know if you prefer me reading it. Doesn't mean the video is shorter, but maybe it makes a bit more sense and I'm tripping up on my words less. I just want to say shout out to Ken Brennan. I think he's a legend. He's convinced me in these two cases. He was hired by the hotel and he solved the case, not in a way that would get him the most money, but in a way that would get the victim justice. It's so easy to victim blame. Can you imagine, especially 10 years ago, the patriarchy just deciding this woman was making this up and pushing the case aside?